Wow, I guess a lot more people like the first Cars film than I thought. That, actually surprised me. Even beyond that, though, I think a lot of people could tell that that last video was pretty rushed. It had been a while since I uploaded something, and I figured that I just really needed to get something out. And I guess I didn't take even Cars 1 as seriously as I should. Let's do better this time around, and we'll start with some corrections about Cars 1. Sally wasn't Lightning McQueen's defense attorney, she was the prosecutor. I didn't mention Doc Hudson at all, whose story resonated with a lot of people. And not to mention, at the end, I stated that Cars watching Cars drive is like watching people walk. Ignoring the fact that foot racing is an actual thing, race walking is actually an Olympic sport. But of course, there was nothing more controversial than me saying that I thought Cars 2 was a better film than Cars 1. It's a take that has been dubbed as insane by some commentators. So, let's talk about Cars 2. Once again, I reviewed Cars 2 in 2014. It's not the best review ever. It has technical problems, and it comes from the perspective of, let's make fun of this bad movie no one likes, instead of it being a real, actual critique. I mean, if there's any Pixar film that people would want that for, it's Cars 2. I think it's safe to say that Cars 2 is the most hated Pixar film. It might not be your least favorite, but it is the clear punching bag in the Pixar lineup. So, let's get the immediately obvious out of the way. Cars 2 is a bad movie. It's a bad movie for several reasons. It's closer to a spin-off than an actual direct sequel. Instead of following Lightning McQueen's story, this time around the plot follows along Mater. And as I said before, Larry the Cable Guy's shtick doesn't really carry for a full movie. At least it doesn't work for this movie. He has one joke throughout the entire film: he's a stupid redneck. Most of the movie's comedy involves him being absolutely moronic and embarrassing himself. This is made harder to stomach because this movie, I guess, has a lesson to learn. Mater is stupid and inconsiderate and clumsy throughout the entire film, but the lesson that the other characters learn at the end, Lightning McQueen in particular, is that we should all let Mater be himself. You know, the guy making an obnoxious jackass out of himself, thinking wasabi was ice cream and making a huge scene that ended up embarrassing everybody. Not only that, but this movie's plot requires other people to be incredibly stupid. Because of the biggest contrived coincidence imaginable, some other cars think that Mater is a super spy and drag him along on a globe-trotting adventure. And no matter how many times Mater tries to tell them that he is not a spy, these top-notch spies don't believe him. If this wasn't bad enough, the misunderstandings in this movie require familiar characters also to drop their IQ like unwatched cargo, the biggest example of which comes towards the end.
Wait, you don't get it! I'm the bomb!
Yes, Mater, you are the bomb! That's what I'm trying to say here! You've always been the bomb!
To make things even more confusing, Cars 2 has an environmental message. Now, on the surface, there's absolutely nothing wrong with a film having an environmental message if it's done well. WALL-E is a good example of a film that has a good environmental message that was done subtly. You can't exactly have an environmental message in a Cars film, because every single character is a car, a gas-guzzling piece of machinery. I understand completely that you're not supposed to take these movies seriously at all. But when you state, for a fact, that global warming exists in the Cars universe, what exactly am I supposed to do with that information, when every single living person since Jesus Chrysler himself was a car? Speaking of which, the world building is even worse here and more clunky than it was in the first one, and in ways that are very hard to ignore too. For example, Axelrod was stated to be the first vehicle to travel around the world without GPS. So, I guess GPS existed since the 1500s when Car Magellan was the first person to circumnavigate the globe. Is that a nitpick? On its own, sure. But there are so many things like this, and they quickly pile up, especially since the concept of Cars stands on a weaker foundation than most other films. Even ignoring the setup, the plot of Cars 2 is very clunky. I've watched this film several times over my life. Don't ask me why, I just have. And not once have I ever been able to figure out how Mater figures out that Axelrod is the culprit behind the murders. Maybe I missed something. To be fair, I probably did. But as far as I can tell, all Mater has to go off is Axelrod's British engine and Wentworth bolts. And then Mater ends up accusing the guy he's never seen the engine of, even though literally every single car living in Britain has a British engine. Even if the mystery is sound, Axelrod's plan overall is absolutely stupid. So Axelrod wants to make a bunch of money by selling traditional oil, and ruining the reputation of alternate fuel. However, by doing this, he's the guy who is selling this alternative fuel that's causing cars to explode. By doing this, he's bombing his own reputation harder than alternative fuels. And here's the thing, as the inventor of this big alternative fuel, Axelrod would still be making money if the fuel was a success. Mater says that he was working with alternate fuel for years and years, only to find oil when the rest of the world was looking for something else. In that case, all Axelrod had to do was just not make the alternative fuel. No one else in the movie is established to be working on alternate fuel. And even if other people were, it would take a while for everyone to adapt to it. Cars 2, on the face of it, is a bad, stupid movie where nothing makes sense. And yet, I have gone on record several times now saying that it is not only not my least favorite Pixar film, but it is also not my least favorite Cars film. I definitely think I owe you guys an explanation for that insane statement. So I guess we'll start with some things that I actually enjoyed about the film. Like, genuinely. Not ironically enjoyed. Yes, I am about to be nice to Cars 2 because I have no idea what my life is anymore. One thing I have to give Cars 2 is variety. Cars 1 primarily took place in 2 locations. A racetrack and Radiator Springs. Radiator Springs is in a desert, and in my opinion that tends to be one of the more visually boring biomes. While there are definitely deserts that have vibrant plant life and multicolored sand, generally you're looking at a lot of brown, and Cars 1 is a very visually boring movie. Cars 2 takes place all over the world, and this is some of the only times that we've been able to see Pixar bring certain locations to life. They've done Paris before in Ratatouille, and I do appreciate the reference that they bring here. And they would also later do Italy in Lucca, although in that case, Lucca's was a smaller village. Seeing a larger Italian city, that is a different experience. It's also pretty cool to see England, but my favorite area in the film visually is Japan. It's a Cars version unfortunately, but I still love Pixar's take on Tokyo. The bright neon lights, the chibi designs. If there's a location that I really want future Pixar films to be in, it's gotta be Tokyo. But hey, the film looks good. This isn't news to anyone. Even the worst Pixar films tend to have really good animation. Even with like almost photorealistic animation, most people still find The Good Dinosaur a bad film. Having good animation and good visuals does not make Cars 2 special. What it does is at least make Cars 2 interesting. It's a globe-trotting adventure, which means that we're never in one place for too long. The movie does generally allow you to suck in the atmosphere of whatever location you're in before moving on to the next one, and it doesn't ever linger in one location for too long. One thing that I could say about Cars 2 is that no scene ever seems to drag. The pacing was the biggest problem with the original Cars. Beyond once again being 2 hours, it took almost half an hour for Lightning to even get to Radiator Springs. Speaking of which, that brings me to the opening of Cars 2. We don't often talk about Cars 2 as a spy film, we just generally wonder why it's a spy film at all. As a spy film, it's no James Bond. Hell, it's not even Spy Kids. But to be as fair as I can, I kinda sorta like some of the action sequences. I think some of them are fairly well choreographed and are actually engaging. You know, when it's not requiring the characters to be absolutely stupid.
Yes, Mater, you are the bomb!
Speaking of action though, I think Cars 2 has the better opening. The first movie's is very slow and it takes a long time to establish the characters and the overall conflict. Cars 2 begins with an espionage mission onto an oil rig that at least tries to set up the tone and the tension and the plot of the film. Also, for some reason, Cars 2 has the most grisly death in Pixar history. The alternative fuel in this movie, when it's put into a car's tank, and they're hit with an electromagnetic pulse, it expands, and the car explodes from the inside out. Which we see in the movie. Cars 2 actually has a surprisingly high death count, and I will give Cars 2 this. It has things that I am never going to forget about it. I do want to make a few things clear that may or may not help showcase my perspective. Cars doing spy things, to me, is no more or less ridiculous than Cars doing romance things. Honestly, considering I've seen Cars do spy stuff in other movies, the spy stuff actually seems more plausible. However, even with that being said, I understand that Cars 2 is absolutely ridiculous. Don't think that I take it seriously for even a second. Because I can't take Cars 2 seriously at all. And honestly, I kinda think that's a benefit to the film. Maybe this is why Cars 2 doesn't annoy me as much as the first one did. The first movie wants you to take it seriously. It wants you to be invested in Lightning McQueen and Radiator Springs and all of that, and I have a hard time doing that. Maybe Cars 2 also wants you to take Mater's story seriously, but when you get down to it, Cars 2 feels like a shitpost. It's a sequel to a racing film that doesn't even star the main guy that decides to be a spy film. I guess this might be what some people call ironic enjoyment, but I don't think that's a good phrase here because while this film does have things that I do like, I still do think it's a bad movie. I do want to make that clear as well. I'm not calling Cars 2 good. I still think it's a bad movie. Just not the most horrendous film ever. Not even the most horrendous Pixar film ever. Something else I should also probably clarify. I dislike Cars 1 more than Cars 2. However, I will concede that Cars 1 is more structurally sound than Cars 2. Cars 1 manages to tell a coherent story. It has a beginning, middle, and end that all connect to each other. And while I didn't like the characters, their motivations made sense for the most part. The super spies not believing Mater when he says that he's not a spy does push believability too far. That being said, I found the first Cars film to be thoroughly unpleasant. I had a hard time liking Lightning McQueen at all. I felt that he started off too selfish to the point that I couldn't get invested to his eventual coming around. I do understand that he's supposed to be unlikable at the start. The problem is more that he doesn't have any other draw. There's nothing else to him at the start. He's just an asshole. An arrogant asshole. He's not a funny asshole, not an asshole who has a soft spot, not an asshole who has some history. Just kinda generic. And when that's your main character, it's really hard to be invested in anything that happens to him. With an asshole character, you need to want to see them improve. And when it comes to Cars 1, I just don't want to watch Lightning McQueen at all. And when you can't get invested in the characters or the plot of a film like Cars, that's when you end up starting to question the premise, which is not something that a film like Cars can really afford. If you like Cars 1, I can totally understand that. I can understand if the backstory of Radiator Springs made you feel something, if Doc Hudson's story hit you just right, even if you were invested in the chemistry between Lightning McQueen and Sally. I'm never gonna get that one, but hey, if it works for you, it works for you. The stuff in Cars 1 just doesn't click with me at all. A lot of it has to do with taste. There are quite a few cliches that I can stomach. Spy cliches, for example. But sports cliches, no, not for me, I can't stand them. Cars 1 almost has anti-chemistry with me. Like, someone decided to make a movie out of things that they pick specifically to get under my skin. Cars 1 is a very slow movie. It's rarely visually interesting, and starring characters that I don't like or find interesting. And while I can say the backstory to Radiator Springs and Doc Hudson is definitely interesting, it's so far into the movie that Cars 1 has already lost me completely by the time we get to that point. And when we're following characters like Lightning McQueen or Mater, it's easy to get pissed at. On the flip side, you have Cars 2. Cars 2 is so badly made and poorly constructed and just ridiculous in the fact that it exists at all. It's not exactly something I can get mad at. I think I've heard this phrase before. If it was better, it would be worse. I think what I see in Cars 2 is what a lot of other people see in the B movie, for example. The B movie is literally a shitpost. Its plot is all over the place and doesn't connect to itself. The title is based on a pun, and it has bonkers decisions, like trying to take the romance between a woman and a bee seriously. The B movie is a bad movie any way you slice it, but most people really can't take it seriously as a bad movie. Honestly, it's probably even technically worse than Shark Tale, but the B movie is just so stupid you can't really get mad at it. And for what it's worth, I think that's the best way to describe my case. Cars 2 is a bad film that didn't make me mad. It's almost too whatever for that. And to paint the picture even further, I'll talk about another Pixar film that did make me mad. Toy Story 4. That is a movie that is much more competently made than Cars 2. The animation is absolutely beautiful. The technicals are all there. The story is actually competent. Characters have motivations that they actually follow through. The story makes sense. There aren't really any plot holes. But Toy Story 4 went so against the spirit of the previous 3 Toy Story films, and made such baffling decisions, asking you to side with really unlikable characters, that it immediately became my most hated Pixar film, dethroning Brave. I'm not here to make believers out of anyone. If you still think that Cars 2 is the worst thing that Pixar has ever done and will ever do, that's completely fair. That's on you. I'm just here to say what I feel. Maybe all of this is nonsense to you, I don't know. But hey, I can't help what I feel. I very much understand that no matter how well I explain, I'm definitely in the minority who picks Cars 2 over Cars 1. And even with that said, I'm absolutely not saying that you should go back and watch Cars 2. That's probably not worth your time. You know, unless you specifically like making fun of bad movies. Cars 2 is good for that. That being said, I do think that the hatred of Cars 2 is a little overblown. Like, it's found itself in the canon of the absolute worst, most horrible animated movies ever. I can think of dozens of animated movies that are even worse than Cars 2, and that's even ignoring things like mockbusters. Off the top of my head, there's both the Planes movies, Chicken Little, Mars Needs Moms, Home, Monsters vs. Aliens, Shark Tale, Lightyear, Romeo and Juliet, Strange Magic. I could go on and on and on. Those are the kind of movies that make it hard for me to get mad at stupid spy car movie. And just because I like Cars 2 better than Cars 1, it doesn't mean that I think it's a good movie all in all. No, if I wanted to argue that a Pixar movie is good actually, I'd probably be talking about The Good Dinosaur. I guess I know what we're doing next week, huh? I think you're gonna soon understand that I have surprisingly weird tastes in movies. As for the Cars films, whether you're a Cars 1 guy or a very rare Cars 2 guy, I think we can all agree on one thing. Cars 3 is the good one.